Hi, I'm Marco, I'm the CEO of Configur, and I've got over 18 years experience in the data space, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of the general day-to-day data challenges that take place in businesses. I'm joined and being helped today by Richard Lewis from Maven.
Hi, I'm Richard Lewis. I'm the founder of Maven. Similar to Marco, many years in the consultancy space, particularly around data and AI, and my business helps promote and take you on a data journey.
Excellent. So, what we're going to look at today is just some of the main data challenges that businesses face when trying to structure, work with data, and make use of AI. And to start with, that all stemmed from what we do at Configur and why we do it. So for many businesses, it's very, very difficult for operational teams, non-data teams, to make use of their data. And one of the things that we wanted to do was make a platform that would make that super easy for them, whilst also empowering the BI teams that have got more advanced knowledge and skills in the space. So we'll start off, Rich. Let's talk about data sources. So when we talk about data sources, for anybody who isn't fully aware, we are talking about, first thing, spreadsheets, XLS files, CSV files, files that are outside of a system. We're talking about potentially CRM systems. I mean, we can name a few, probably HubSpot.
Do you want to go with SAP? Should we not?
Yeah, absolutely. Finance. We've got things like Xero, Sage, many different options. So we work across 15 sectors, and everybody has some variation of these kinds of tools, and they all get brought together into source data. Now, these are individual files in this case. These are systems and connections to those systems in these cases, and each of the different teams may touch these in various guises. You might use partly some spreadsheets, maybe part of the CRM. Other teams will use the CRM entirely but don't use anything else. But what's really important when it comes to that operational team is the ability for them to have that data centralized. Would you agree with that, Rich?
I would, and I guess what's interesting in that picture, what is missing, I guess, for a little bit, is all of the external sources that you can add to that. Because the power, I guess, from a data perspective, is the culmination of multiple data sets to provide you with, I guess, a much broader, richer, deeper picture that data can provide.
Absolutely. So once we have all of this data, now what would traditionally happen in BI teams and in BI processes is you would probably build out an ETL process, so extract, transform, load, and that would be driven by a question that the business might have. So that question probably sits right over here somewhere, and this is where your business questions sit, often driven from directors or managers in the team or something else, but you kind of need to go from here to here. And the reason that we set Configur up in the beginning is that when we were working at a chatbot and AI company, we realized that the operational teams, there are processes and people who can get them from here to here, but they rely on them to have to speak to them on a regular basis to make changes. But how does that operational team try and surface some of this themselves, and not at a strategic level across the entire business, but also at a level that is going to support their specific team? So one of the first challenges when we said bring the data together is quality often, right? So how do we make sure that this data is of good quality? The biggest challenge you've got with spreadsheets is it's what we would class as unstructured often. Lots of teams will just make changes to it, lots of versions that exist across the business. So one of the things that need to happen is on the way in, this data needs to be validated or cleaned. And I think this is a good opportunity to talk about this because there's two real key ways we can do that, right? First one is automation. So how do we automatically clean it? And the second one is manual intervention or support. So what have you seen done well there, Rich, with this kind of process before?
That's a great question, actually, because I think there's probably 3 or 4 key components that most businesses struggle with at this point. And you've mentioned the first one, which is quality. Automation of things like qualitative tools is very difficult, it's very expensive. If you've got a large enterprise type platform, typically that is quite a complex set of skills that the business requires to enable you to be able to do that. I guess the question from me then, from a Configur perspective, is how do you take the pain away from organisations who will be ingesting large, multiple data sets and providing them with that qualitative measure?
So this is a good point. So there's a couple of things. So if people want to use this as a SaaS product, they don't need additional support from us, they can. So we have tools in the platform that automatically allow them to do things like set rules on this data on the way in. And what that will do is it will help validate the data. So it'll look for things like gaps in the data, required fields, being able to apply what we call validation lists, which allow them to say there should never be a value outside of this value that within that data. So it will help them clean it. But then because of the way that we operate with a hybrid model, they can, if they want to, turn on support from us, whether that's just for onboarding, which might see them to first few weeks maybe, or it might be for the entirety of however long they'd like to work with us. And what that will do is we'll have data analysts who will work alongside them, understand what the challenges are with the data, potentially source some of the best information from different versions, look at where the gaps are in the data. And sometimes, right, you have to have manual intervention. You can't always automate cleaning of data, unfortunately. But I think that's a big thing. And then and more recently as well, there's a whole another section here for us, which is, I'm going to put this in green, and that is AI-driven analysis. And I think this is another big point, which is you have unstructured data across the business, things like operational tickets or reports. So, because here we've only talked about structured data, stuff that comes from a structure, but over here we've got things like reports that are written. You might have tickets from various different systems that say, I had this problem or this was an issue that we needed to look at. And then sometimes you even have PDFs that just sit outside of any kind of data structure that you need to clean. So these can now feed into our AI process, which will do a couple of things, but the main thing is it will take unstructured data like this, convert it into structured, and then give them another data source that you can actually report on, which is
so give important. Me the interesting point with this is the example, I think, that brings this to life.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about documents, when we're talking about the types of organisations that might be interested in that, legal firms, accountancy firms, where do you see and what kind of clients do you currently have that use this more complex sort of data that is outside of the norm? Because this would be sort of the typical data set.
So I think this is a really good one because so we've got a transport company we work with quite closely that has route crime tickets. So these are operational things that happen where somebody will type out information and it says things like, this person trespassed on the tracks at this location on this date. Somebody then has to manually sit there each month. They would have to then take that report and, well, we call it the swivel chair, right? So they'd swivel around and then they have to type that into another system. So what our AI process does is it allows it to extract all the key bits out and then turns that into structure and then passes that as a data set. So actually has data that is all very structured, all very similar, laid out in the same fashion. And that's when you're able to then do things like report on numbers, right? Rather than it being in a report which is outside of any kind of analytics or any kind of system.
So we're talking about structured documents in sort of PDF format.
Yeah.
What about things like free text fields? So can you consume data on that in that context and use AI to do some sort of natural language processing or some form of automation of that information to be able to create a structured sort of component?
Exactly the same principle applies. So things like HR tickets, people putting in complaints, things like that, you can extract all the key markers from that. And it's so important, right, that this isn't just a standalone process. This is something that gets monitored and there's a human in the loop. But again, it's about having the functionality and flexibility for something to bring all this together for the operational team without them having to know how AI works, without them having to understand what needs to happen. They can just review the outputs, make sure it matches what they would normally do, and then have that then going forward in a more automated fashion. Potentially, I mean, with some of our clients, saving them, 8-9 days a month doing this kind of thing.
So the next question I want to ask is about where you store the data. So one of the biggest and most expensive parts of this for any business that's looking at building a platform is how do they store it, the cost of storing it, the complexity around security and all of the other bits that sort of wrap around that. How does that take that pain away from an organisation?
So we store all of our data. So if we're working with UK companies, typically it's stored UK-only data centres. We host all of the data. So any data that comes into our platform, we will host it securely. We will make sure it's encrypted, in transit, and at rest. So it means you know that you're working with a really secure infrastructure. And the other thing that we do to help keep the cost down is we're built on what's called a serverless infrastructure. So we will spin up and down on demand, which helps keep the cost down. It's not something that our clients or anybody else has to worry about. It's something that you can just be safe in the knowledge that you're working with a system that's ISO protected, has all cyber essentials and all of the kind of certifications that you need to work with, basically. And that kind of then gives you a really nice foundation to be able to understand what you actually want to do with it.
Okay, so one more question around that. So we're going to move probably into a data engineering conversation now, but people are consuming data in vast quantities. So how do you make sure that the data that is being consumed into the platform for the clients that you're servicing are only consuming the data that they need, data that has value associated to it, and also what does the retention and archiving piece look like? Because from a sustainability perspective, taking this away from an organization means that they have net zero credentials that they could start meeting in this context because you're taking that complexity away from them.
Yeah, so when it comes to data ownership and who owns the data, the client always owns the data, so they can take that away as they need. In terms of retention, we'll store it for as long as required. We typically say 3 to 5 years to make sure it's kept on our systems afterwards. But also when it comes to things like, you're working with vast quantities of data in some capacities, you can do things like automatic roll-up on the data. So we can say, you might have records and records of information, but actually after a year, you don't need to keep every single individual record. You just need to keep the numbers, and that can automatically be applied as well. So all of the more complex, horrible, difficult stuff is handled. Yep. And then that actually opens itself up to saying, okay, how do I want to do something with the data? And that's where it really gets powerful, because things like these API integrations, so APIs are just a way of us connecting into the other systems that happen, that are in place. So if we have an API here, this basically passes us the data, and it can be on a schedule or it can be done on demand. But we can also send information back the other way, and that helps with things like collaboration, keeping the data up to date, making sure that information's all kept as accurate and as recent as possible. And I think that's one of the big differentiators with BI platforms, where they're more consumers, whereas what we try and do, as we'll come on to, I'm sure now, is more about how it can be an operational asset as well as insights.
And I guess when you're structuring this from a data architecture perspective, from a data lineage perspective, there's an opportunity in that partnership to educate businesses that might not just be asking for you to provide the full capability, but have their own BI capability or data capability, and help educate them in that context. Because again, hugely expensive resources around data architecture.
Absolutely.
Hugely complex in terms of data lineage, data literacy, all of the fundamental data governance pieces. I guess from your perspective, you're able to impart some of that wisdom back to the organisation.
Absolutely, and that's what the support and the hybrid model is there for, to help push them forward into that space. And it kind of comes on to, I suppose, this side of things now. So if you take this source of data that you might have for an operational team, it's got benefit to two types of people. So the first person it's got benefit to is somebody within the operational team. The second person that it might have benefit to is somebody in the BI team. And then the third actually is somebody who is a director, stakeholder, senior manager. So this gives you 3 tiers. Now, why this is important is obviously if we're working with operational teams, typically when we look to embed this, then what are we going to do with it? And we'll come on to that. But the BI team, they are massively overburdened with having to do reports for operational teams day to day. So what we try and do is help the operational team do everything I'm about to show now. So first thing they can do, they can create 360 views on their data. So if you can basically build a data model very easily, and we help them do that. So you can take all of these different bits of information and you can smash them all together, essentially, to be able to have visibility across what's happening with all of them.
So simplify that for me. If I am a housing association and I want to understand the 360-degree view of my tenant, or if I'm a healthcare provider and I want to understand my patient. So you could have your property data set, which has all your properties. You click on your property, that would tell you
any compliance surveys they've had done. It would tell you any contact points they've had across the business. It would tell you other things about the property you might need to see, but you'd have all of that information in one place, whereas typically it might be spread across multiple systems. They would have full visibility of that. And that's obviously on an individual level, right? So for a individual property. But the next bit that they would then want to see is things like, we call them queries, which are insights into that data as a whole. So my query here might be, how many properties are overdue on compliance for fire and safety, for example, in that example you gave. So this would then give you, which would, multiple things. You could have a data set which shows you numbers. You could have a dashboard which shows you a graph, and we'll come on to it, but you can also have a conversational output as well, which tells you exactly what specifically is happening.
You could also have a forecasting and prediction capability within that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, as I said, then dashboards. So these are your more traditional dashboards. And the thing to say here is that all of this stuff is done in a completely code-free, easy drag and drop way. So typically with BI tools, it's not always very easy to work it out, or you might have to spend some time trying to figure out all the instructions. Configur sort of leads you through this process in a way that is very much, I want to drag that data there, I want to select that information, and I want to build that graph, and you're clicking a few buttons and it's building them for you. Now, the real benefit is when you bring all of this together, you can then pass that into what we would call portals. And by portals, we mean views, ways of looking at the data, and this can be segmented for different audiences. Now that audience might be within the same team. That might be a manager versus a member of staff, or it might be a stakeholder director that needs to see not only this information, but data from somewhere else in their own portal. But the key here is that it brings all of this together in one place. So you have a one-stop shop. And where there's even added benefit is that your BI team over here, who typically will have their own Power BI tools, for example, they will say, well, we have standard reporting as well that this team looks at on a regular basis. We don't have to rebuild it all. So you can actually bring that back into here, and you can embed Power BI dashboards, for example, into the Configur platform. So now I genuinely do have a one-stop shop of everything that's either ad hoc, operational, or even, longer term standing reports that you've always had to look at.
Talk to me about the portals thing. So if I know we're going to talk about senior stakeholders in a second, but if I'm a non-data literate, or if I'm not a coder, I'm not very proficient on Power BI, in terms of the portal piece, how does the platform simplify that transition from me having access to the data to me telling a story about that data?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. The first thing is that it makes it very visual and easy to understand where everything's laid out. The second part, and this is kind of probably branching more into the Abby side of things. So Abby is our artificial business intelligence layer that sits on top of the platform. The first thing, it will give you insights into that data. So if I'm looking at a graph, traditionally a graph is difficult to interpret. This will pull key insights out. So you get key insights on that graph, and it will tell you maybe 5 or 6 of the top takeaways about what's happening to that data. So for example, if I've got a graph showing, revenue over time, it will tell you where the peaks and troughs are, maybe something about the seasonality of the data, but you don't have to go and work that out. It gives you the answers to that. The other part of what it does is Abby will help you actually build these out. So there's a whole conversational, so you will have heard of LLMs, but there's a natural language process to that. You can ask questions and it will actually build the queries and the dashboards for you. So there's a NLP process. And then on top of all of that, on top of the whole portal, we then have the Abby chat. So Abby chat is a way of bridging the gap between what would traditionally be ChatGPT and those kinds of tools, which are fantastic tools, but they're not trained on your specific data. You also have potential security risk passing your data into those models. You don't necessarily know where it's going. So what Abby does is allows secure access to only your data rather than a larger language model which is open to the web.
Great. Okay, so we've talked about visualization, we've talked about analytics, we've talked about telling the story through sort of reporting capability. I think what excites me from a consultative perspective is more around the Abby piece. So let's just dive into that a little bit. Let's talk about what's in it for me, what value do I get from using the Abby component if I'm a non-technical, senior stakeholder, non-technical, small, medium enterprise, whatever that may be, and also for teams that have technical capabilities, because I think there's value in both.
There is, yeah. So I think traditionally, we've had to have, all of this stuff is fundamental to get us there.
Yeah.
But and I think we have to have things like dashboards for standard reporting. It's all standard. The big challenge that comes with all of this is that, as you said, as somebody who's in the business, whether you're a manager answering for a team, if you're speaking to a director, there's always a question you get asked in the middle of a meeting that you don't know the answer to and they haven't done the report for. It's always those difficult questions. And also, you don't know what you don't know, right? So that is why this is so important, because what Abby does is it lets you actually just ask the questions of your data. Can you tell me where this KPI hasn't been met? Can you tell me which team it has under-delivered on target? Can you tell me where we are in terms of revenue? Those kinds of questions. And the key bit here is that it then goes and asks your data for you, converts that into the queries and the insights that you're going to need, and pulls it back out in human language and gives you the answers.
Yeah, so the key component that you mentioned in that, I think, is about the simplicity. Yeah. So the problem that most people have is they're scared of, I don't know how to run a report, I don't know how to use Power BI, I don't know how to do whatever I need to do. I guess talk a little bit about how Abby simplifies all of that through a simple question, through a simple input, because again, if I'm non-technical, if I'm a house builder or if I'm a local authority and I want to get to the nub of some data, just talk around how Abby simplifies that entire process through using AI.
So it's, when you ask your question, you type it like you would ask. You're basically asking, Abby is your data analyst that supports your business, right? Yeah. So you're asking your data analyst the question. The question is, can you tell me why, what revenue it is this month that we haven't hit or have hit, or whatever the question is. And what Abby then does is it uses natural language, as I kind of briefly touched on, but it converts that into a query, and it goes and hits the database, looks at the data that you've got in the database, and it finds the answer for you, and it will push that answer back to you. Now, what's important with this is ChatGPT and those kinds of tools become familiar interfaces for a lot of people now, and it's just a conversation that you have with a chatbot. So in the same way, we'll pass that information back, but there's added value with what Abby then does, because it will then give you a couple of extra options. It will say, give you the answer first off. You can then click Insights.
Graphical and text answer?
Yes, both. Initially, it'll give you the text, and then underneath it says, would you like more insights, which you can click a button and it will go and pull more detailed breakdown on that. Or you can click the graph button and it will build your graph.
Reports.
Build your graph, yeah. And you can add that to your dashboard for future use. Yeah. So it's actually helping you build.
So from a question, you get a text answer, you get the option to build a graphical representation of that answer, and you also get an automated report based on that single question or multiple questions.
Absolutely that.
So the power in this is I only need to ask a question and you do a lot of my reporting for me.
Correct. And that's another key bit here as well is yes, you can use that end layer to build this stuff, but it's actually scattered throughout this whole process as a support tool as well. So Abby is sort of wrapped and ingrained now in the entire platform. So sometimes a good one is queries. I don't know what I want to ask sometimes. I'm looking at my data, but maybe I'm not entirely sure. So you can actually click a button now with Abby, and Abby will give you 5-6 questions you might want to ask of the data, and you can click the button, it will then build them for you as well.
So anybody that's got Copilot would know that Copilot is overbearing, it's in everything. From an Abby perspective, I guess, how does that work from a user interface perspective? Because you don't want it to be overbearing, you want it to be a simple interface that doesn't overpower or overtake all of the, I guess, all of the benefit that you've got from the platform.
Absolutely. So it's a little Abby button in the top corner, and it's only turned on or accessed when you press that button. So it's out the way, but it's there to support as and when you need to. So we try and keep it slightly more subdued. When it comes to the full chat, though, you click the button on the portal, instant access. And what's going to be more exciting about this as well is that there will be a mobile app coming out for it as well. And the mobile app is really good for when you're on the go, because nobody likes working with data when you're traveling, when you're sat in meetings. And I think that will be one of the things that will unlock so much capability for people going forward as well, which would be fantastic.
We've got a director's box, senior stakeholder box, executive leader box, whatever that may be in that context. So talk to me about the working on the fly, because I guess if I'm in a committee meeting, if I'm in an executive board meeting, whatever that may be, we always get an uncomfortable question. This is potentially the tool that enables you to quickly ask that question and respond to that without having to say, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer.
Correct. And I think business intelligence as a whole typically used to be driven, as I mentioned earlier, by the questions that you needed to ask first to make sure you had the data. And with the implementation of AI and what we're doing with Abby, it flips it completely on its head. And all of a sudden, the director doesn't have to try and preempt every potential question. They can be in that meeting, ask the question, and hopefully 9 times out of 10 get an answer for a more complex question than they would have had to do before. So it can be really, really powerful, and it's about ease of access and quick information. And the good thing here as well is that we're capturing the questions that are getting asked on a regular basis. So if that director does happen to ask a question that Abby doesn't know the answer to, it's about then letting the team know that there was missing information, maybe, and 9 times out of 10, it ends up getting pushed all the way back here over to the source data to say, well, there was no information on it. So where does that sit? How do we fill that out? So it's a little bit of a reciprocal process as well. It's going round and round, but it's constantly trying to improve, trying to push forward decisions and help with everything else that it's trying to do at the same time. So,
and critically, what we touched on before, that's only doing that in the confines of your platform. What it's not doing is taking learnings externally. It's not taking data externally. So you're maintaining control over quality, output, and the types of things that Abby is then producing as trusted data outcomes.
Yeah, it's about having the trusted sources. I think the biggest challenge we have with large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, those kinds of tools, they are amazing for the wider coverage and generative stuff. But when it comes to actually working with your data, the one big risk that businesses have are hallucinations. Because if you do have a hallucination or a miss number that's passed through to your data, it can have a big impact if you make a decision based on it. So it's all about trying to get as much quality, security, and governance around this as possible. And that's what Abby tries to bring.
And it also gives you the curiosity, doesn't it?
It does.
So it doesn't necessarily give you the answer to everything. That's why you have a BI team, or potentially you have the other capability that Configur provides. Yeah. But what it does give you is the ability to start exploring your data, asking questions of your data. Correct. That enables you to make decisions, ask more questions, change the way that you look at your business. And I think that's where the real power is.
Yeah, so I think it's a really exciting direction that we're going in at the moment. So I think it's more now about looking at what people can do with it and exploring the art of the possible and letting people trial it, play with it, and feedback. And I think that's what's really exciting for us at the moment. So I hope you enjoyed the whiteboarding session with us today. If you want to find out specifically how this can help your business, we would love to chat with you. We'll give you a demo and run you through where we might be able to help.